Welcome everyone. Today I'm very excited to present our very first webinar, which is on gap assessments. And my name is Ashish. I'm the founder and CEO of CanSat Consulting, and been working in compliance space for now 10 years, handling various sort of things, whether working in the food industry, agriculture, or cannabis. And very excited to present our first webinar today. And we have today with us Jessie Tang. She is a very dear friend of mine and then has been in this cannabis and the compliance space for very long, almost 10 plus years. She is the CEO and founder of Square Bean Consulting. So, Jessie, welcome to you. And today's webinar topic is on the gap assessments. And it is very important topic if you want to be in cannabis industry, FMCG industry, or any other sort of industries, because it can save clients tons of money before they go out and spend hundreds and thousands of dollars in building their structure, facilities, or auditing their systems. So let's just jump right in. Okay. So my very first question with Jessie is on the gap assessment, because everyone, all of you might be curious about Jessie. For those of you who may not be familiar, could you start us by explaining what exactly is a gap assessment and why is it particularly important for cannabis companies who are operating in such a complex regulatory environment?
Yeah, thanks, Ashish. And let me start with the first question. First of all, gap assessment, I like to think about as, in simple terms, an analogy of like you want to get somewhere and exactly finding out what the gaps are so you can fill in those gaps. Kind of like I'm building this puzzle, that's my end product. What are the missing puzzle pieces, right? In simple terms, that's how I see it. And why is it important? I like to break it down into several points. The first is it's almost like a systems health check. How healthy is your system, as in your quality systems, your facility? Is there anything missing? What's missing or what shouldn't be there? What's outdated or what needs to be improved? And also if your system is ready to receive any impact. And when we talk about impact, it can be as small as production errors, small deficiencies, small equipment breakdown, to larger impacts like major recalls, major complaints, or even a business crisis potentially. So that's one point number one. Second is like compliance check. Are you meeting Health Canada requirements? And perhaps companies decide to go on and add other certifications like exports, GACP, EU GMP, etc. And knowing this is where you want to get to, what am I missing to get there, right? And doing gap assessment kind of helps you to prepare for your first audit or even future recurring annual audits, etc. Point number three is your resource planning. And when we talk about resources, I like to think of it as it could be your infrastructure, capital expense. You might be buying new equipment or even planning like who you are hiring, planning your resources for human resources, even sourcing new vendors if you need to. And the last thing is continuous improvement, right? Companies want to thrive to do better. And so doing gap assessment really help them to add these building blocks. How do we get better every year, after every audit, after every gap assessment?
Thank you, Jesse. That was a very good answer. And I think you have covered all the crucial points why we need to have a gap assessment. And when I talk to clients or the companies, I think one of the key thing it comes to their mind, whether it's mandatory or not. But but if you're not doing a gap assessment, it's basically buying a house without doing an inspection. Will you spend 800 or $1 million without knowing whether you have done an inspection, what's wrong with this house, whether it's moldy or not, whether the roof is going to fall down, whether you have to spend $30,000 in building something. That's what the importance of gap assessment. I give the analogy to the client, and that is where all of these crucial elements. Now you multiply that by 10 times because companies spend millions of dollars in buying facility in the mergers and acquisitions and all of those things. But if you're not doing a gap assessment of your site or your facility, and not just the site or facility, but the documentation, because documentation is the key. You can look at the wall, but you wouldn't know what's wrong with the mold contamination, what's going on issue on the storage structures. Maybe there is a significant pest contamination, which can lead to recall in the future. So that's why all of these crucial elements make it very important to do a gap assessment. So I think my next point comes down to obviously after knowing the gap assessments for our audiences, what are the general steps to be involved in conducting a gap assessments. And I will be looking to answer into these few points here. And Jesse, I would love if you have any more points to add on to that later. So if anyone is looking to do a gap assessment for their facility, the question is not when, but start now. If you are a new facility, brand new, then you start now. If you are already running and you think everything is going well, there is no better time to start your gap assessments now. So the very first step is to identify what is your jurisdiction of regulations which is going to apply. So for instance, if you're in Germany, you need to go with the EU GMP standards. If you're in Canada, you need to go with the GPP standards. If you are in Australia, you have to go with the Therapeutics Good Administration's GMP standards. Know your jurisdiction, create a detailed checklist based on that jurisdiction, and also cover where your product is going to be exported to. For instance, if you're sitting in Canada and you want to export the product to Europe, let's say particularly Germany, you cannot just comply with the GPP standards for your product. You also need to know whether you need to comply just GACP or EU GMP, or maybe you're already packaging the product in the retail level and selling it to Germany, so you need to have to get it through the EU GMP facility. All of these elements requires brainstorming with your QA team. So create a detailed checklist. After you create a detailed checklist, do an assessment of your facility. Go around your site and visualize everything, what could go wrong. That things which could go wrong should be in your checklist and covering all the standards, and make notes on it, minor, major, critical. Don't just say yes or no, because yes or no is not going to help you prioritizing your gap assessments, because your resources has to be on the risk and the priority basis. And that's where the risk assessment plays a significant role. So once all the assessment has been conducted, identify your high risk and maybe medium risk, and you have to allocate your resources to make a corrective action plan for those medium and high risk areas. If you have the resources, you can do all of those minor, major, and critical observations to tackle on. However, if you do not have a lot of resources, I would say prioritize on the high and the medium risk. High risk, for instance, that you see that there could be a potential source of significant contamination. One of the high risks could be that you do not have a proper vendor assessment program and you're just buying cannabis from any random facility. You haven't vetted them, you haven't sent them any questionnaire, and just based on Health Canada or CRA license, you're saying the facility is good. However, that's not the ideal way you should move, especially when you're looking to export the cannabis. After developing the corrective action, the next step is implementing those changes. One gap I always find working with clients is you can create a very beautiful corrective action plan. But if you cannot implement it, if you cannot execute it, you have spent a lot of money not doing anything. So make sure that not just the quality department, but your production department, your security department, your QC department, if you have a separate QC department than QA. All of them are involved, or at least key members from these departments, and they are assigned responsibilities as part of their corrective action plan. And make sure that your corrective action plan is detailed and the goals are measurable, so you can actually evaluate those goals after a certain period of time, and that's very important. Once your changes are implemented, you have to evaluate those changes. Now, there are two ways to evaluate those changes. First, you can actually form a team internally, like whether you can have your QA, head of QA, and then he can pick up one member from each department, and you guys evaluate the changes and the effectiveness of those changes which you have implemented. The other option is hiring third-party consultants who can actually go around the site and on your documentation and provide you a detailed report to verify the effectiveness of your implementation. I do recommend the second approach because then you're not getting a bias approach. You can actually review the findings and also kind of implement based on the third-party review. And I think the last and not the least, which Jesse also mentioned, is the continuous improvement. Gap assessments, similar to internal inspections or any other assessments, is not a one-time thing. You have to make sure that every year or frequently, like depending on your organization, you're doing the gap assessments on a regular basis and document it. Because one of the key thing with anything in the QMS world, if it's not documented, it hasn't happened. So make sure that all of your changes are implemented and documented, effectivenesses are checked, and then keep doing it on a periodic basis. So these are the steps to go from gap assessment. Obviously, it will differ from company to company, but the importance of that cannot be undermined. Okay. Yeah, Jesse, to you if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, I kind of have two tips to add on to that. With gap assessments, make it digestible and not to do everything like on your own. Oftentimes, like the quality manager or the head of compliance is like, oh, I have to do the whole thing myself. And sometimes you know, get help within your team. Maybe have smaller chunks divided to like operations manager if they can take on one piece, right? You'll feel that it's a lot more manageable and to not do it all in 1 day or 2 days. You break it down to several weeks if you need to, and see what's must have and what are nice to have. Focus on the priority, like she said, the must have first before you move on to the nice to have. And then on the challenge of implementation, always an ongoing challenge. Doesn't matter what facility, doesn't matter how big the company is. Like from my experience, um, whether it's startups, small companies, or multi-sites, always to get support from senior leadership, and so that you're not feeling like quality and compliance is doing it on their own, and the rest of the department is doing something else. Really have the support throughout the company, and it's really important to get leadership from all departments supporting that too.
Absolutely. And to add one point here, I would like to share a quick anecdote here. So recently, when I did a gap assessment for a company, what I noticed while doing a gap assessment is like while going through the site, they had a lot of structural damages. And so the structural damages were there, which could actually lead to the rodent infestation. And also, it can easily be identified during the audits. Now, if it is just for a GPP facility like Health Canada, obviously it's a major requirement, but the standards are not might be as stringent compared to if you are actually complying with EU GMP requirements. That is where it is very important if you can do the gap assessment before, like when you actually not close to the audits or when you are not actually wanting to get a certain certification and you're doing at the last moment. Because if there are any structural changes, if there are even any design changes, like if you want to put a airlock, you don't have an airlock facility, if your pressure differentials are not working as it should be, you could actually fix it in a timely manner. Because documentation, let's say you can fix it, like you can put hundreds of people or whatever the resources you have to fix it. However, like the structural changes sometimes are not in your control. Like you are relying on third-party vendors, you're relying on construction companies, you're relying on making sure they're complying to the building codes and standards in your jurisdiction. So that is where everything is not just about the documentation. Okay, you also have to consider the overall premises, okay, including with the documentation. So that's where it plays a critical role.
Mhm.
And I think moving to my next question, which is always a question in my mind, or I always get asked is, so Jesse, how often should companies conduct gap assessments? Is there like a magic formula, or so that they can be stay compliant and competitive? Like how often they should do? Is there a recipe to it?
Yeah, I would say the short answer is it really depends. And I'll explain why. There's no like magic number, but there's some kind of a standard, I would say. So first is like, what is the purpose and intent? Is it your very first one? Are you trying to, like you mentioned earlier, are they getting EU GMP? Is it something that they need in a few months, or is it they have more time, like a year down the road, 2 years down the road, and they're just really preparing, getting a whole picture of where they're at. So really, the purpose and intent, what is it for? In terms of priority. The second is like, where is the company at? Are they just starting up or are they building multiple sites? That also would be depend on how they allocate resources, how much time do they have, right? And the scale of the gap assessment itself. The third thing is the risk level. Are they pretty much fairly compliant overall? Do you have support within quality and compliance department? Your senior management is supportive and like, getting the CapEx in. We have budget to build things and changing infrastructure. That also can affect a lot of things. Like if they're really ready to go, gap assessments can happen right away, and these changes can happen that really affect where the risk level is for the company. So those three things, and the long answer after looking at these three things is the frequency. Like I would say annually at least to kind of stay on track, just like how we would normally look at documents at least once a year, right? And doesn't mean, again, not just like that one time, you can spread it out through the year, but overall, you're looking at your system once a year. And depending on those factors, maybe there are high risk areas or systems that you want to look at quarterly. Break it down throughout the year as needed. So that's kind of the long answer version.
Okay, no, I like the answer. And actually, as Jesse have explained, even in my experiences, like there is no regulatory standard which says that you have to do the gap assessment frequently, like quarterly, annually, or something. Like there are some for, let's say, internal inspection, which we are going to cover later. But for gap assessments, it is, and this is where it makes it a little bit challenging for the companies, because if for an organization they're thinking, well, if it's not written anywhere, why I'm doing it? Well, the idea is, like, if you're buying an insurance company, is an insurance company just going to give you an insurance based on you told your name? They're going to ask you things about your company, correct? They're going to ask you whether you have this, whether you have these elements covered, how long you have been in this industry, have you had any major claim filed before, because that can increase your premium for the insurance. So similar to this, you don't have an insurance company, but you're doing this for yourself, for your organization. Now, how frequently you do it, it depends on the risk, as Jesse touched based on. Pretty much all the standards I've read about it, and specifically in the ISO standards, like everything is based on the risk, and risk is a big element. You cannot allocate your resources similarly, like whether if you have one observation or you have 100 observations. It's based on the risk and the criticality of the risk you have. So if you are operating in a high risk environment, like let's say you're working for exporting cannabis, and you're not just domestic cannabis, your risk is higher compared to if you're operating just in a domestic cannabis environment. Then the risk comparison is, if you are operating in a cannabis environment and just doing B2B cannabis, your risk is lower than if you're doing cannabis on B2 retail. And this risk also you will see during your inspections. Because if you're B2B, you might see that the auditors might not be as stringent compared if you're doing B2C, because the risk is directly on the consumer side. So the frequency, as Jesse mentioned, keep it at least annually. You cannot go 2 years. That's what my advice would be. Keep it at least annually, because that's basically a general standard of any inspections. However, if you are on high risk, or if you have never done a gap assessment, you could even go once every 6 months until you see that your non-conformance has reduced significantly. And then maybe you can switch or increase your frequency for gap assessments. So consider all of these factors, and it doesn't have to be complicated. I see it sometime, like when I work with clients, or even when I was employed with different industries. There are always two spectrum of quality assurances in the gap assessments, or even with any other assessments. One who is going in very, very granular details, one who is not caring enough, like there is this just missing all the details at all. You have to strike a balance and make sure that your resources are aligning with that, so that you have enough resources to execute the gap assessments, not just create the report and leave it. Like you have to evaluate whether it was effective or not. And that's a very key thing, execution and effectiveness check. And that's, if you don't do that, that's basically you have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars in fixing things, but you don't know if they're working or not. Okay. And then you might keep spending or keep doing the same thing annually, which you might know after the effectiveness check. No, I have to change my strategy. I have to do something else. This is not working. My contaminations are not getting reduced. And one very good example I have is, I won't say the name of the company, obviously, but one company I worked with, we had a lot of customer complaints. And they were one of the client, and the customer complaints, we had huge amount. Like I was every day we will get customer complaints, and the complaints were getting backlogged. They were backlogged, and we had almost 100 plus complaints all the time, pending, backlogged, and required to be fixed. Like you have to close these complaints, then you can move forward. Now, the simple fix is you write one complaint at a time or figure out how to do it. But if you don't identify why those complaints are coming, what is the root cause? It's not common to have 100 plus complaints. So you have to trend your data. You have to identify what are the issues of having that complaint. It's not just simply writing a non-conformance report and close it, because writing 100 plus reports every time is not an ideal solution. However, if you pick up a gap assessment challenge just to identify on that particular process, and break it down, reverse engineer why it is happening, what is it happening, and then try to fix it using that approach, then you can fix in a timely manner and evaluate after 6 months whether your complaint frequency has gone down and on that particular subject. If it's still up, then you have to reevaluate. So that's where your risk or the frequency of gap assessments comes into play, depending on your problem and your structure of the facility. So my next question, which is also one of the key important question in if you think about gap assessment, and this all comes from experience. It's not like a made up thing, because we have done Jesse and I have done so many gap assessments, so we see and we understand that the gap assessments could lead to bigger problems if you don't do. So some of those problems, what could happen if you don't do gap assessments or if you don't do properly? So very first thing I will start from the top, which is licensing. If you are a new licensing applicant, um, so you obviously do not have a fully functioning facility. You have a facility as a part of the licensing requirement, depending on the jurisdiction, but you don't, but that's not fully functioning. If you don't do gap assessments, first of all, you wouldn't know what are the challenges you're going to face in next 6 months. And a very simple example is when we started new in Canada in cannabis industry, facilities were built out pretty fast. But then they realized that they needed drains in the cultivation rooms. And if you imagine what is the most one thing you apply in the cultivation room is water. And if you don't have the means to take out the water, you're going to spend hundreds and hundreds of hours in the production team to take out that water using a shop vacuum. Now it's a simple thing, correct? It's not, and it doesn't have to be complex. But that simple thing is going to cost you a lot of money, and it's not something easily fixable. Like you cannot just simply build out a drain in all of your cultivation rooms. So all of these things could have been simply checked if you would have reviewed your floor plan. And in your floor plan, for instance, you would have mentioned where the floor drains are. Or maybe some third party would have walked around your facility during licensing and they could have pointed out that you don't have the floor drains. And the reason is licensing organizations or even the Health Canada or FDA or whoever it is, they're not going to ask you for have a drain in your facility in this cultivation room. But that is a requirement as a company you want to implement. So gap assessment does not just highlight the regulatory requirements. It also highlights any operational requirements from auditors' experience or from your own experience so that you can actually tackle that challenge in near future. And the second thing I would say is fragmented practices. I have seen this so many times, and it pains my heart to see that if I go to a facility, I've been called upon when when someone has implemented 15 sanitation forms for a four-person cannabis company. So if an industry with 4 people, 5 people, like a small industry who are just starting new in cannabis world, they have to fill out 10 to 15 sanitation logs and they are forced to do that without any explanation why you need to do that, is it going to work out for them? No, they're going to just fill out the documentation all the time. But do they need just one form? No, they need a balanced approach. They might need 3 or 4 forms to cover the whole facility and comply with the requirements. And also, when you have to fill out a log, think in terms of efficiency. If you fill out one log, it takes 5 minutes. And if you can optimize that to fill it in 3 minutes, for instance, you're saving 2 minutes. Now multiply that by 5 times a day, multiplied by number of people, multiplied by number of days you have to fill. You're already saving a lot of money. So the idea is to optimize your QMS, and you will not be able to optimize your QMS if you don't review your QMS, not just blindly follow it. So that's where it's very important to review the QMS and ensure that there are no fragmented practices. And for that, training is important. So if you do the proper gap assessment, you will know where you have to prioritize your training efforts. For instance, maybe you are seeing contamination in your facility and you don't know, and it could be very simply coming from the visitors in your facility. Because when visitors walk in, you just ask them to wear a lab coat and they walk into the facility. Maybe they're bringing powdery mildew. Maybe they're bringing aphids. The solution could be they wear a full-length coverall. So these are all the elements when you look at the gap assessments in detail, you can identify. And last and not the least, I would say is revenue loss or loss of market access. So we are in this environment right now where just complying with the minimal requirements is not enough. Like if you just comply with regulatory requirements, it's not enough anymore. That's why you see in a lot of food packaging, even different sort of cannabis packaging, we try to highlight the importance of different branding elements. In cannabis, you cannot do so much, at least not in Canada. In state, there are some leeway, like you can do some sort of branding, but Canada is obviously very strict. But basically, the idea is that even though you cannot do the branding on your packaging, you can do the branding through your website. You can say that I have got this certification. I got certified through this. I got GACP certification through WHO standards. I got EU GMP certification. And that builds a strong reputation with the company who's going to buy your product. Even in domestically, we are seeing that trend where domestic companies are asking for more certification. Previously, it was just provide me this document and that's enough. But now they're moving towards doing virtual quality audits. They're also looking for how often you do these assessments. And if you tell them that we are doing our gap assessments every year and this is a report, you have a better chance, obviously, showing the company that you are on the top of your game. And also during mergers and acquisitions, like the companies are, especially in highly regulated environment, they're not just buying based on how much revenue you are making or what loss you have. They also now go and look at your inspection reports, and that's what we also ask to them. Like if you're buying a company, don't just based on the financial statements. Look at their regulatory inspections. Look at their number of non-conformances, whether it's critical, major, and then make an assessment, and that also gives the negotiation power to them. So that's where all of these elements come into play and helps you to stay compliant. Yeah, Jesse, to you. Sorry, I kept speaking about it.
No, all good. I just want to add to your point of like reporting things on gap assessment, just so I don't lose that train of thought. Just because on paper, even if you see companies have very little findings, let's say, it doesn't really that might be the service level only. Just because something's not reported doesn't mean there's no underlying issues. And I kind of encourage companies to look at gap assessment different than like inspection reports. How are they different? In inspection reports, you see two findings, two minor, the company's probably in much better shape than having 10 major findings, right? But internally, when we do gap assessment, we want as many findings as possible because we're identifying them ourselves and we're demonstrating to auditors we know where we're at, we know what we need to fix, and it's documented, it's shown that, hey, we have a plan in place. We're not just waiting for auditors to tell us what's wrong with our system. So like that's important.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And so this is what my experience is also. I totally agree with the Jesse's point is that when you're doing an inspection, the auditor's mind and coming to same, just paraphrasing Jesse's point is that to find and consider worst case scenario. Because I mean, obviously it doesn't help you in the personal life, but in the auditor's life, that's how it is. Like you have to find all the worst case scenarios so that the company you're doing this inspection for, like they can actually pick or they can actually allocate the resources to fix something high priority, medium priority, and then go to the low priority. Though, and that's how some of these inspections we are also noticing when we do, for instance, GACP inspection, they break it down into essential and basic. So you have to pass 95% of the, sorry, 100% of the essential and 95% of the basic to comply with the requirements and to get the GACP or the IMC GAP certificate. So that is where it becomes very important is doing these gap assessments because you might not identify something which is not an issue right now, but you might be able to identify something which could be an issue 6 months or 1 year down the line. And that could save you a lot of money in long term. So that's why it becomes very crucial there. So I think my next question to you, Jesse, is, and this is an interesting impromptu question it came. When we talk about gap assessments, a lot of it sound very similar to an internal inspection. So the gap assessments and internal inspections sound very familiar if you're just talking about it or some of the elements overlap. Can you highlight what are the key differences between an internal inspection and a gap assessment?
Yeah, really good question. And there's definitely some similarities and differences. The major difference, first of all, is gap assessments. You're preparing for what's happening in the future. You're forward looking. You're planning for something you want to achieve down the road. Versus internal audit is more current. You want to look at your current shape, where you're at in terms of meeting your internal SOPs, or if you're complying with Health Canada regulations. And also, usually internal audit, we're looking at three things. Like I like to look at internal audit as a system, right? There is production walkthrough. You're looking at your facility. You're talking to people. There's the interview part. You're talking to employees to make sure if they are no, they know what to do, what their jobs are. Are they understanding fully your SOPs? And then the third part is your records. Now that you have your systems implemented, your people are doing their jobs, do you have records? Like everything needs to be documented, right? Otherwise, it's not done. So do you have those records supporting that? That's the internal audit part of it. Versus gap assessment, you're preparing for if you want to get EU GMP, for instance. Do you have the forms to meet those requirements? Do you have the SOPs written, or how many do you need to still prepare in order to meet those requirements? What kind of training you need? Like that's more forward looking in your planning, right? You want to recognize as many gaps as possible, so then you know how to resource plan and have these systems in place and prepare for your actual audit. That's kind of the main difference.
Awesome. No, I think I really like the point where you explained about that how the gap assessment is future looking, while internal inspection is your current environment you're focusing more. And I think that is where it is not so much common for general industry to understand, and there is an overlapping. Well, like if I'm doing internal inspection, they're same as gap assessments, but they are not. Internal inspection, as Jesse mentioned, like you are doing a lot of general current elements, and your internal inspection could also be very much broken down into how you want to do it. For instance, you could have an internal inspection just doing for a QA department 1 month, second month you go with other department, and there is no fixed recipe. Like you can do the same way for gap assessments too. However, generally when the gap assessments are done, the idea is to conduct all that gap assessment in a short period of time for the whole facility and identify everything. And because that's the main intention, like you can identify the gaps as soon as possible. So I think that's a great point Jesse has touched based on. One thing I will actually come back to my previous question. One of the key element which I find a lot of gaps is also document management system. So if, for instance, your revision number, your version number, how you have your forms identified, how often you are updating your forms, whether the revision number is, say, is also changing when your revision number on the SOP is changing. Now, these kind of elements seem very simple, and they are simple. But if you do not implement your document management system properly and not assess properly, what happens is one, you will have multiple version of the same documentation floating around. And if you're a bigger organization, let's say 50 or 100 plus people, like you could have multiple version of documentation floating around, and to fix your document management system is going to take years. And there are companies who reaches out specifically to fix their document management system, to make sure their SOPs are trimmed down and they're compliant and all that kind of thing. So that is where when you do your gap assessments, make sure you are also taking a key role and understand whether you have an efficient document management system, not just document management, but an efficient. And efficient as in you have someone who created a draft, then they have reviewed, then they have approved. Do they have the restricted permissions? Are you using a paper-based system? Are you using an electronic system? And all that kind of elements come into play. So make sure your document system is up to date. Um, my next question is actually comes to, I think we are to our last question. I didn't even realize we were just talking about it. So I think to wrap up the discussions, I have a question here. Gap assessment is such a valuable tool for cannabis companies, and I want to summarize basically for our audience that why it is important for you to grow and succeed in this complex environment, complex cannabis environment, and what are the key points to be coming up with. One of the key point I would like to highlight here, and I would love to have Jesse's point after that on that too, is first you need to do the gap assessments to reduce any failure of future outcomes. That's the one of the key point. We are doing the gap assessments to reduce any future risk. Okay, and everything is around the risk, so you can control your high risk environment. Especially if you are a new licensing facility, this is the best time for you to do before you get into operational requirements and you already have people working. It becomes much more challenging, and we see it all the time. When you have people on your facility, you have to stop the work, you have to hire the contractors, then you're not making money at that period of time. So it's a lot of revenue loss. So first point is for the future outcome. That's why it's so important. The second point, um, it is a valuable tool for cannabis companies is because it gives you a better brand image in outside world. If you are part of a virtual quality audit or a direct quality audit, someone visiting your facility, you can capitalize during those audits that we actually do our gap assessments annually or this or semi-annually or whatever is the case, and we create a report. You can capitalize on that. And in this competitive environment, if there is one company who can show that they are on the top of their game and doing these assessments regularly and have the documented reports compared to one who does not, obviously the QA department is going to recommend a company who has that advantage. So that's one of the second key advantage I would say is to it increases your brand value and image. And third, and the most important is to avoid high risk elements such as recalls, cross contamination. And I will give you a very good example here. If you are a newly licensed facility and you bought a facility from someone, let's say, or you restructured it, and if that facility has been used previously for welding or any other high risk elements, and you haven't done a risk assessment, you wouldn't know what your facility is contaminated with. So everyone knows that we have to test for certain pesticides, we have to test for microbial elements before we release the product. And I have seen cases where some facilities have been used previously for medical grow. And at that point of time, there was no control on the pesticide application and they applied pesticides throughout the facility. The filters were never changed. Filters were never cleaned. The facility was washed down, but the filters were not changed, which are basically stuck inside the HVAC system. So if a gap assessment would have done, the product contamination could have reduced, which only the client came to know after 6 months of growing 4 crops. If you know about all these elements, you can actually as a part of your gap assessments, you could actually go and check when you bought the facility. Filters are changed, filters are cleaned or not. What this facility was operated before. If you know it was operated as a medical grow or as a welding organization or some high risk elements where maybe there is a risk of pesticide contamination, then you could actually do a pesticide swab on how to reach areas of your filters and reduce those risks significantly. That's where it becomes more crucial for you to avoid these high risk elements. So this is what I will summarize to and just say to you.
Yeah, really good points here to kind of do a recap. And I just want to add a couple of points is, having a gap assessment, you are documenting what you know, right? So you're demonstrating, you're giving auditors confidence that you have a solid system, you have a solid team, but also to your management leadership, senior management, that you have a plan in place. Because sometimes there's disconnect between quality and operations of senior management, or you have leadership from parent company coming and visiting and they're like, well, what are you working on? Well, hey, we have this plan in place with all these gaps, and that's keeping us busy. Right? Then you have something to demonstrate and show them that you're confident in maintaining your system and getting the company to where it needs to be at. And also for budget planning, like cannabis companies, like we all know there's very common investors, right? They're not physically working in the company, but like, what do you have to show them that this is how much money you need in the future? Planning in the next few years, where is the money going? Capital expense. Like having a gap assessment, it translates to like bigger things like that. So just to
Exactly.
consider it too. Yeah.
No, I love that investor point which you mentioned because we do not have a lot of mergers and acquisitions happening in cannabis world in Canada. They used to when there was a high green rush, but in the US of a bigger market, I do see when I talk to clients and all, like they have this merger and acquisition always going on, or at least someone is talking about it. So, and Jesse raised a very good point, and I think I talked about it before too. Um, the companies or the investors are becoming more and more careful before they invest in cannabis, and this is going to get a little bit. This risk assessment is going to get on a higher side. Like it's not going to get that investor will invest just so easily. And to give the investor a confidence to invest in your company, they're not going to know what is gap assessment. It's not their job. It's your company's job when you want to get acquired and get the big bucks out of it, is to show them that you are conducting this assessment, this and you have conducted the assessments, and the result of it is not just the assessment. The result of this assessment, you have reduced your non-conformances, you have reduced your complaints, you have reduced your returns, which translates into dollar values. So you have the starting point of an assessment, and the end point is saving money. If you can show that element, it directly resonates to the investor. Investor is not going to review each and every point of your report. It will be someone an investing company might have hired who is going to look at the report. But from investor point, if you can show that implementing these strategies in your company, it turns out into profitability for you. It turns out into reducing costs for you. That's going to be very beneficial for you and give you a better negotiating terms. So on this note, I think we will close the gap assessment webinar. Hopefully, you all have learned something new. And if not new, at least you can capitalize on from your own experiences and apply gap assessments to your individual organization and create an environment of compliance in the cannabis world. Okay. Thank you, Jesse. Any last words you want to say, Jesse?
Oh, I think I really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for
Awesome.
having me.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just going to see if we have any questions come in. So I have one question here. How do evolving state and federal regulations influence the need for frequent gap assessments? So probably this is for Jesse, and then I can maybe put my answer there. Also, I will repeat one more time. How do evolving state and federal regulations influence the need for gap assessments?
Actually, I'm going to actually have you answer this one because I don't really deal with the state side of
Sure,
things.
no issues. So I will tell you basically, and it's a very interesting question because in states, obviously everyone is aware about that the state has a fragmented cannabis system. Like they're not as federally legal, obviously, as Canada. So different states have different requirements, and some of those requirements are wide apart, and some of the requirements are closer, you know. However, there is a one trend we have noticed is that many companies are going towards not exactly mandated by the particular state, but they are going towards compliance towards CGMP or GMP. And now, mark my word, this is not same as EU GMP because the GMP's definition of the compliance also varies from where you are applying, which jurisdiction you are applying. However, CGMP is a common term which is used under current good manufacturing practices and compliance to the cannabis, and they are applied to the cannabis companies similar to food industries. So basically, the gap assessment, as I mentioned in my one of the answers, is that you have to know your jurisdiction. In this case, the jurisdiction is not just United States. The jurisdiction is your state, and you have to comply with the state requirements. And you also have to go and find where this product is going to sold to. And now within the state, if you are, let's say if you are in Boston and you're selling in Boston itself, then you have to comply obviously with the requirements of the regulatory standards of particularly involved in the Boston or Massachusetts. So that's how basically you have to comply with those regulatory requirements for and evolve as the gap assessments go. You can proactively work on that and by maybe getting a CGMP certification. And this is common in food industries. It's not mandatory for cannabis yet, but we think that it is going to be the case in next few years where the CGMP or GMP will become mandatory for US cannabis companies because we have noticed in New York for certain categories of processors, they mandate that you comply with the GMP requirements because the risk is obviously higher on the processing side than the cultivation side. So as I said, like you have to read the jurisdiction you are in, the jurisdiction you have to comply with, and create a checklist for you, which is detailed enough to cover all those elements, and then do the gap assessments. And that's how you can keep up to date and making sure that you are also have someone who is always looking out for next regulatory updates coming in your jurisdiction, because in US states what we are noticing is the changes are happening really fast, so you have to be up to date and implement those changes. At some point you might also have to do process validation, for instance, so you need to be aware how to do the process validation and who to hire that for, what is the scope of that process validation. So all of that elements might come into play. So I hope this answers the question there. Let me see if I have any other questions here. I think there is one, but I believe this is already covered by Jessie. So what are the most critical compliance gaps that cannabis face, and how identifying them early prevent costly issues like recalls? I believe, Jessie, you have already touched base on that a bit, but do you want to still go through it, if you don't mind? Maybe just add a few points.
And I would say general, the biggest challenge is constantly a battle between quality and operations, right? Doesn't matter what facility, small or large, what industry, it's always, that's the nature of the job itself, right? Finding the balance between meeting requirements, and yet, operations, their job is go, 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 output, shipping things out, get things done. And that's just the nature of the job. And finding the support and a balance between the two departments making things work.
Absolutely. And I would add one point here. So in cannabis companies, there is or not just cannabis, any companies you're working in, or if you are in senior management or even a CEO of a cannabis company, accountability is very critical. No one wants to make mistakes, but the mistakes happen. So while I was working with one client, what they had implemented is any of the gap assessments or the inspections report which are generated, those reports were being sent to the CEO. So basically, the CEO took the, I would say, initiative to be involved in this. Now, obviously, senior management in that case is not going to be micro level involved in all of your assessments or inspections, but they can review the high level summary of reports. And those reports can help them to understand whether this is improving, whether the money they're spending in these assessments is actually improving the system. For instance, maybe you had 100 complaints in the month of January. Now you did a gap assessment to specifically to identify the gaps in the complaint handling system or complaint management system, and you want to see if it pays off. Then you submit the report in January. Now in June, your CEOs get another report, and if they see there is 200 complaints, is the system working? Probably not. So you might have to reevaluate that, and CEO might ask for it, right? But if you could reduce it to 50, is the system working? Yes, because you have reduced the complaints to 50. Then you evaluate after 6 months if you see there's a further reduction. So trending of your data and also involving the senior management can actually be very useful in reducing these high risk environments like recalls. And most of the time when have been involved in recalls, uh, the root cause is very simple. It's never a cause of a recall. It has been very complex. And if and to identify those simple things, you have to review your documentation carefully, that review your system carefully, and that's where you can pinpoint after brainstorming session, oh, this could go wrong if we don't do this. This could go wrong if we don't do this. And I will just add one last example to keep it short. One of the recall which I was reading about was because the product was a cannabis raw material was bought by one company, and was processed by another company. Now, the company who bought the raw material, their VQA was not so effective. Like they obviously looked at few elements, the assessment was done and all, And the recall was happened because the product which we received or whoever received that was contaminated. But the COA was satisfactory, so it was never caught. Now the COA and sampling is just one tool in compliance. It doesn't give you a magic wand that your product is compliant. So that's where you have to look at the sampling, whether the sampling was done representative or not. If you pick up 5 gram or 10 gram of cannabis from one bucket, where you have 50 buckets of cannabis for the whole lot, that's not representative sampling. So as a buyer, if you don't look at those kind of elements, or if you haven't vetted the companies to have a representative sampling procedure, you don't know. That is where it is important to do the gap assessment. You could do a gap assessment for your supplier qualification program and identify the gaps and fix it. So I hope this answers the question. And to keep in time, I think we finish in 50 minutes, Jesse. So that was pretty good. And I would like to thank you for joining us today and contribute to this webinar. And I hope everyone learned something about it. And we are also going to share this video on our LinkedIn channel. So anyone who hasn't joined or who wants to learn more about the gap assessments, they can go through this video, and we're looking to do more of such webinars. Okay, thank you, Jesse.
No, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you guys. Take care.